trying to figure out how to start, I thought, seeing that you came up with an exotic name for your book, a good reason to buy it if you're walking down the bookshelf and you see something that says, How to Live Forever, I would buy that. So how do you live forever? I take it that's not the total thesis of the book. I mean, I know I've read the book. But why did you title it How to Live Forever, which would be what most people would aspire to?
It started out of outrage at the $45 billion that Silicon Valley is spending now to conquer death. And I'd like to live as long as possible, but there was a billboard I kept driving by on my way home from work that said that the first person to live to 150 has already been born. And it got me to think, why are we so obsessed with living so long? John F. Kennedy in 1963 got up in front of Congress and gave his most important speech on aging, and he said we'd added years to life. Now it was time to add life to those years. And since that time, we've added 2 months a year on average to the American lifespan. And now we're, spending enormously on living longer. But what about the life to those years part? I feel like we've not spent nearly as much money, time on that side. And I think that the result has been this accumulation of years, but a season in search of a purpose. What is the purpose of all of these years? Rather than focusing on, adding another 100 years to the lifespan, let's do something worthwhile with these years that have already accumulated. And
I'm going to get to that, but I was having dinner with my wife before he came here, and I was thinking about, the concept that there are more people over 60 than under 18, and that there are 1 billion people in the world over 60, and by 2035, these are all out of your books and everything. I don't know any of this, but there'll be 1/3 of the population will be over 60. And then I thought about our political life right now, and then I wanted to ask you whether age, which seemed to drive your philosophy, is probably good for the political world. And then I thought about Hillary and Biden and Sanford and et cetera, and so maybe age isn't good. And then I thought about the Constitution. So here's my question. The Constitution was written a while ago. And in the Constitution, you can be president, you have to reach the age of 35. To be a senator, you have to reach the age of 30. To be a congressperson, you have to reach the age of 25. Why haven't, in all your research, that the age, not the 40 to 50 where you're nurturing your own children, but the age 50 to say 65, get a second life? Your work has been about getting back to something different, to give back. Why hasn't the Congress changed and put an amendment to make the ages older to serve? Because the founding fathers must have thought to be 35 to be president, we would really mean that would to be about 48.
Right.
So should we be looking at people that are in that 45 age plus, or are we happy going back for this youth culture that we seem to be embodied in? That is a complete non sequitur question, but I had an argument with my wife over dinner at this, and I thought you could answer it for us.
Well, I agree with whatever position you took.
Oh.
No, what it's reminding me of is, and I think we don't realize this, so 65 as the definition of being old was based on not even a 20th century idea. In 1935, we set that as the eligibility age for Social Security, but it was based on the Prussian military pension that Otto von Bismarck ordained in the 1870s, convinced that the state would never pay out a single pension. He was 78 at the time when he decided this. And there's an economist at Stanford who says, we'd never use $1935 in 2019 without adjusting them for inflation. So why do we use the 1935 definition of being elderly, of being over the hill, as if it was some eternal verity?
That's my question. That's exactly my question.
Yes, and
for a whole string of things, including mandatory retirement, which is now pretty much gone, and Social Security, and when you're supposed to put yourself in an old age home, and all of that stuff. So why hasn't the world come to that?
It's a time warp. We set these things up at a time when life was supposed to be 70, and now half the children born since 2000 in the developed world are projected to see their 100th birthday, and unless we take stock and adjust things in a way that not only suits us in the present, but going forward, we're going to have these bizarre anomalies of, whether it's in the political realm or in the workplace, where we're pushing people out at a juncture when they're in many ways reaching their prime. It's not going to work also when we have this new ratio in society that you mentioned of more older people than younger ones. We're going to need everybody pitching in to make the society work.
But everything that seems so obvious wasn't obvious to somebody. All of your writing comes to the conclusion that there shouldn't be age segregation. My take from it is a little bit like the difference between societies that don't have women in the workforce as opposed to societies like China and, say, the US, where you double your efficiency by having women. So now you have brought to light, which seems so obvious, if you can add in the billion people, or just take the people in the United States, and that age when you're still able to perform and you're really not wanting to go to Sun City.
Right.
Wouldn't that add economically? Forget all the social reasons, the getting rid of the depression, getting rid of the uselessness, getting rid of the, drooling in bedpans before you should be. I guess you don't drool in bedpans. But anyway, why are you the only one on this? What's happened?
Well, there's a science fiction writer named William Gibson who says that the future's already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I think really many people are starting to live out this new pattern, even though society hasn't given them permission and made it more difficult. But I think it is very much like the example you gave of the women's movement. I think we'll look back 50 years from now and try to figure out how we survived as a society, writing off this enormous source of talent. And I saw it in our own work at Encore. We gave out, 10 years ago, we started giving out a prize for social innovators over the age of 60, which was blasphemous at the time because innovation's supposed to be the exclusive province of young people. And at the end of 10 years of giving out this prize, we had 10,000 nominations of people who were making a monument out of what used to be the leftover years, who were really doing their best work. And it turns out there's an economist at the University of Chicago, David Galenson, who studies creativity. And he found this auction house in Amsterdam, which had recorded the value of every significant painting sold since the 1850s. And he then did a regression analysis to try to understand the age of the artist at that point. And what he discovered is that there were two great bursts of genius. One was early, think Mozart with these symphonies, blossoming out of his head in a kind of conceptual way. And the other group of most valuable paintings were done by people later in life. And as he looked more deeply into it, he realized that conceptual genius blooms early and experimental genius blooms late. So,
by the way, Picasso, in the last 3 months of his life, painted a painting a day. And when they first came out, the art world kind of were critical of him. Now it's considered his second greatest period. And he was on fire to make your point in the last 6 months of his life.
And Cezanne did his most valuable work at 68. Louise Bourgeois, maybe the greatest American sculptor, was at 60 teaching middle school in Great Neck, New York, having never done anything. And then her work took off, and yet culturally, our conception is that genius is something that goes with youth. And so many people, when they're reaching their most creative period, are shoved to the sidelines. Malcolm Gladwell did a piece in the New Yorker in which he compared Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles. So the Eagles have 3 greatest hits albums by the time they're 24, and Fleetwood Mac fails in 7 different incarnations as a band. They've got gray hair and kids who've graduated from high school, and then they do Rumors and start reeling off the best-selling rock albums in history. But we've been so enamored of that first story that we missed the second one.
So why is the U.S. one of the worst culturally in the Americans' DNA that idolizes youth? But that's okay. I think idolizing youth is good. But discounting age, it's interesting because I'm still doing what I do, and I go around to the studios with all the people that work for me don't add up to my age. And when I go, they're very nice to me. And I can see they're thinking, who is this troglodyte in the room? Yeah. I can see it in their eyes. I can see like, okay, go to croquet.
Yeah,
it's time.
yeah.
Why is the American, as opposed to say the Japanese, why are we so intent on not doing what you've said in your books and your lectures, which is, and it's expensive, I guess. Why do we not encourage the redirection of people that are not decrepit, but still, and one other thing, I don't know why, I shouldn't be talking, by the way, but in your book, which I thought was interesting, I think it was in your last book, you talk about women and the kind of belief, incorrect belief, that once they're past their childbearing age, they should die.
Right.
But men can still do it for the rest of their life, basically.
Yeah.
And how that is not true.
Right.
There's what is it called? The grandmother effect?
The grandmother hypothesis.
So explain that, because I like that.
Sure. And I was going to say something about the first point you made too, which is, and I didn't realize it, I didn't write about it in this book, but I did in the last one, which is that this idea of older people as superfluous was not how we started. In fact, when the Puritans came to America, they were enraptured with older people. They felt that if you lived to a ripe old age, it was a sign from the divine. And so deeply was their infatuation with age. So it's at the beginning that people actually tried to look older than they were. They wore the white wigs.
So how did that change?
Well, and even to show how absurd it was, that they had special tailors who could make people look like they were slumped over. I felt like I should have been a Puritan. I would have been pre-slumped.
My mother would have been so happy about my posture.
And they lied on the census. They would say that they were 2 or 3 years older than they actually were, whereas we do the exact opposite. We say that we're 2 to 3 years younger. Well, one of the reasons it changed is that older people got kind of haughty and enamored of themselves, and it led to this reaction against these entitled elders. But even still, through most of the 19th century, we had real harmony between age groups. We were by the beginning of the last century, we were the most age-integrated society in the world. We had people worked on farms. They lived in multi-generational households. They went to one-room schoolhouses where students were sometimes 40 years old, along with children. There was no consciousness of age whatsoever. People did not celebrate birthdays. In fact, knowing somebody's age would be like knowing your blood type. And then that all changed in the 20th century, and we reshuffled society in ways that we thought would be more efficient. We put young people all together in schools, we put middle people in the workplace, and then we allocated older people to senior centers and nursing homes and retirement communities. Out of this, I think, ultimately false belief that that was a better, more efficient way to organize society.
Was it economic?
It was.
I mean, people invented Sun City and all those things.
Yeah. I think what it was, I think there was a kind of economies of scale notion to it, and that you could educate young people better. And a lot of these things grew out of what were progressive reforms, child labor laws, universal schooling, Social Security led to the growth of retirement. But the end result is, I think, a grievous wound that we've inflicted on ourselves, and which ties into your question, all the separation of the generations about the grandmother hypothesis. So, like you were saying, for many generations, evolutionary anthropologists couldn't figure out why women lived beyond reproductive age. Men could go on. These were all
beyond men.
Right. And these were all male evolutionary anthropologists. And there was a woman at the University of Utah, Kristen Hawk, who decided that she was going to solve that question. She spent a lot of time in Africa, Latin America with hunter-gatherer tribes, and she focused on the role of grandmothers. And what she discovered is that it was grandmothers taking care of babies that enabled both parents to go out and hunt and gather and get more food, and that enabled the long, helpless period that human babies have, that enables our brains to grow big, and that separates us from all other species. And her basic conclusion is it's grandmothers that are responsible for human beings. So on Mother's Day, we should be celebrating our grandmothers.
By the way, our foundation, which is centered, the idea is on intergenerational work, and we got to it through a lot of different ways, including your influence, plus the fact that my mother was as a 17, 18-year-old woman, was reading and teaching to kindergarten students, and the kindergarten students loved it, and my mother loved it, and I didn't really think this was evolutionary, or that my mother was a gatherer. Sure,
she's definitely not a hunter.
No, she was a hunter. She just wasn't a gatherer. So it all of a sudden made sense when I started reading that chapter, and then we started talking in our foundation about the idea of all sorts of things where older people and younger people live together, work together, teach together, which is, again, creating what you are doing is people who over 50 may move into a different world, a different lifestyle, and get into intergenerational work. It's possible.
I think that's what, when I was thinking about the book and it's almost, how do we adapt the grandmother hypothesis to the modern family world? How do we take these timeless truths that are so deeply rooted in human nature that we've really been in danger of losing because of all this radical age segregation, and bring it back in a way where everybody benefits? And I think one of the discoveries for me over the last few decades doing this work, I started out in almost a labor economic sense. How do we get untapped resources and unmet needs together? That billion older people who are looking for a sense of purpose, and all these young people who need support. And what I realized is that's not just around clearing the market for labor, but there's actually this fit between older and younger people. It goes back to the grandmother hypothesis, but if you look at developmental psychology of children, older people, Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who was one of the great child psychologists of the last century, co-founded the Head Start program. At the end of his life, he was asked, wrote thousands of scientific papers, do you have a soundbite? What did you learn from all that? He said, what every child needs is at least one adult who's irrationally crazy about them. And then you look at the parallel research on older people, and it turns out that it's almost like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So as we get older, there's a psychologist at Stanford, Laura Carstensen, who has discovered that when you get a sense of there's less time ahead than behind, that people focus on relationship. You know, if somebody tells you got 3 months left to live, you don't say, I'm going to go out and study the oboe. You know, I always wanted to pick up an instrument, or, you know, maybe now's the time to learn Mandarin. You focus on the people that you love, and people have a kind of deep, inchoate understanding as we get older that there is less time ahead. So we're relationship focused. Then it turns out that these skills connected to relationship, emotional regulation, empathy, there's another body of research shows that, you know, even though our knees go bad and, you know, we can't hear as well, we get really good at relationship. And then the third is that we're driven particularly to relationships that flow down the generational chain. Maybe it comes from the grandmother hypothesis, but the Harvard study of adult development, 75-year study of happiness in adulthood, shown that older people who connect with younger generations are 3 times as likely to be happy as those who fail to do so.
Well, that study, which started with the class of Jack
JFK,
Kennedy,
yeah,
and has been followed every 5 years since. I guess it was originally a study to find managers of Sears stores,
right.
which is how they started. But I studied that thing as part of our foundation, as part of other stuff. And you're absolutely right. What they determined was, at the end of it, and it's still going on, and the conclusion, I thought, after hundreds of pages, was the happiest people. It was not the money they made. It was not exercise. It was not, advancement in their company. It was that they felt that they were mentors to a young generation. One. Number 2 was that they did not discard a sibling because the sibling was difficult, that they kept committed to what they should be. And 3 was that they had a significant person, often a spouse, but it'd be somebody else, for the long term. And those 3 things is what the Harvard study determined, and exactly what you said. But let me ask you a question. You wrote your first book, I think there's 25 years between books. You started right after Yale MBA. When you're young, as you were writing about old people, it's credible. Sometimes when you're old, writing about old people, it's self-reflective. What is the difference between your attitude from 25 years ago to today, where I think your last book harks very much back to your first book. So what is the difference in you? I mean, you grew up in Philadelphia. You went to a school where there were 5,999 white kids and 1 black kid.
Right.
George
Washington High School.
Your father was a gym teacher. You were the first one to go to college. You get out of Yale, and you dive into this field. If I was writing a script for a movie, I could not figure out a backstory that fit with that. How does that work? That doesn't seem. It seems like you should be an investment banker or a lawyer or something.
Well, it really. I never thought I would be 60, which I am now. When I was.
Why did you think that?
Well, you're focused on. I was a young person working on kids' issues, and
but most young people think they're going to live to 500.
Right, and they think that they're going to be 25 the whole time.
Right.
And it was really, I think the common thread is just what you were saying about the Harvard study. One of I remember one of the quotes from George Valent, who led the study, was "Happiness is love, full stop." And that was what I saw in working on kids programs. But
you didn't do that at Yale. You
no,
didn't do that at Swarthmore.
Right. No, I didn't. But when I was at Swarthmore, I got to experience it personally. I have a hard time getting things done, and that was true from the beginning of college. I set I think the Division III record for incomplete classes in my first 2 years. I'm not sure if it's been broken yet. And the problem.
Well, 5 books is getting things done, by the way.
Well, I started this book out. I told the story of the first book where I hadn't started writing it on the day it was due to the publisher, which, as you can imagine, made me very popular there. I had gotten to the point where I wasn't sleeping very much. I had a bathrobe and I tied the strap to the chair so I wouldn't leave. That didn't work. And so I was procrastinating further yet, and Amazon existed at that point, amazingly, and I noticed that the book was for sale on Amazon, so I ordered it, and overnight delivery. So I thought, maybe I'm just having a terrible nightmare, but it never came, and that was a continue. I stood by the door for 2 days. I unhooked my robe.
But why this subject?
Well, and so
what in your youth or in your white housing, which you then moved into multi-racial housing, your school, Yale, what went off in your head to say, at least for the moment, I'm going to concentrate on generational, on intergenerational, on kids, or whatever?
Well, when I was struggling to get anything done in college, in order to get an incomplete class, they made you ask the professor for permission. You had to fill out some forms, and then you had to see this wizened elderly dean named Gilmore Stott, and that was the secret ingredient. So with 9 incomplete classes, I got to visit Gilmore Stott a lot, and he became my mentor. And he
was it that you just were not interested in organic chemistry, or you were not interested in Chaucer? Well, what is it that created these incomplete classes? Were you drinking? What was going on?
Yeah. I think I just I had the student equivalent of writer's block, but it was this mentor who took me under wing, and he never gave me advice. He never said you should do X, Y, and Z. He just made me feel like no matter what, I belonged. And it had such an indelible effect. I think I was looking for that when I would go out doing research on kids who were struggling against the odds. I had an eye out for where are those adults who are irrationally crazy about them. And then I ran into this study. It's the parallel study, really, to the Harvard research you described. There was a wonderful social scientist at the University of California, Emmy Werner, who came up in 1955 with the idea that when everybody was studying why kids failed, juvenile delinquency was the parlance of the day, she knew that some kids always managed to succeed no matter how bad the odds. And so she studied the entire birth cohort of kids born on the Hawaiian island of Kauai in 1955. Now, that's not, first of all, anybody who could figure out how to do a 40-year study where you're going to Kauai all the time, I figured that's she must have had a collection of lays, in her closet. But it turns out sugar plantations, grinding poverty, alcoholism, growing up in Kauai was no Hawaiian vacation. And she wanted to understand, she predicted that a group of kids would be resilient. And in fact, she was correct. They would make it, and she wanted to understand what they had in common. And what they had in common was an adult who took them under wing, oftentimes a grandparent figure, sometimes a coach, a barber, and that was the common ingredient among them. And it raised this fundamental question: if that's how these resilient kids manage to make it, and they all seem to have this charisma or this internal wherewithal to recruit these adults to do that, could we provide that kind of support to a wider range of kids who couldn't find it on their own? So we did a study of the Big Brother, Big Sister program, been around for 100 years. 70,000 kids were being matched, 30,000 were languishing a year and a half on the waiting list. We took 1,000 kids, 500 got Big Sisters and Big Brothers, 500 got waited the 18 months. At the end of that period, wanted to see what the difference was. There was a 50% difference in school truancy, a 46% difference in using drugs, 33% difference in violent behavior. And it was so dramatic that all the most successful mentors, they were going to McDonald's and eating trans fats and undermining the longevity revolution. Why did that work? And
research we did, I think it was at Disney, was the most important person in a young person's life turned out to be only one of two things: a parent or a teacher. And then we were involved with teacher awards, best teachers. And it became apparent to us that smaller schools, sizes, and all that, so kids could have a teacher if they didn't have it at home. So this research all connects
together.
Yeah.
And it shows that it raised this. That's how I got interested in older people, because it raised this question: if these kinds of bonds are so important, and teachers have big classes, and need additional support, why are 30,000 kids languishing a year and a half waiting for that? And the reason with Big Brothers Big Sisters was because the people they were recruiting were all people in midlife who didn't have enough time to spend with their own kids, much less 10 to 12 hours a week with somebody else's kid. So it raised that question: where are the human beings to do the things that only human beings can do? And even then, it seemed like hidden in plain sight was this vast and growing older population set to double in size. And when you looked at use of time studies, they were all watching TV. That was and this was really bad TV. It was before Netflix, it was before Amazon Prime. So it just seemed like there was a win-win opportunity looming.
So if we all agree that reprogramming, retraining retirees 50 to 65 or 70 takes training, takes commitment, takes government commitment, takes a lot private commitment. Who pays for? How does that all get financed? Because it is a new educational thesis. It can't just happen unless 200 million people read this book. It just can't happen. So there has to be a political ingredient to finance this strategy. What is that?
What seems, in the current environment, like something that's impossible, almost unthinkable. So I decided to go around the world to try to find places where they were doing that, and I ended up in Singapore, a state the size of LA that's spending $3 billion, Singaporean dollars, so 2.1 billion US dollars, to create a kampong for all ages, kampong being the Malay word for village, built around the idea of intergenerational harmony. And that sounds very lofty, but the effort there is ruthlessly pragmatic. And they're basically executing the Eisner Foundation strategic plan society-wide. So every new preschool and senior center that's built are co-located. All of the housing, and the land is all owned by the state, is built around an idea of 3-gen flats to create proximity between older people, younger people, people in the middle. They're mobilizing a volunteer corps of 100,000 Singaporeans, most of older Singaporeans focused on young people. And it's a very compelling vision for the society. It's this grand Singaporean plan. I went from Singapore to the UK to see the opposite model, because in the UK there's a wonderful financial journalist you probably read for years, Lucy Kellaway from the Financial Times, who 2 years ago, at the age of 58, wrote a column announcing that in a year she would no longer be writing a column. She would be standing in front of a low-income classroom teaching maths, being one of those teachers like you were describing in the Disney study. And then she did something that no American equivalent, no American role model has done. She challenged her readers of a certain age to quit their jobs and to join her. And the floodgates burst open. 1,000 people signed up for 20 slots. There are 50 applicants for every slot. They eventually bumped it up to almost 50 slots. But it showed how much people were wanting to be asked. So here, you got the grand plan and the Pied Piper. Where does that leave us as a society? And what was striking in both of those cases is that when Singapore decided to do this grand plan, they went to the United States for ideas. And in Lucy Kellaway's case, she was inspired by her daughter, who was in the British equivalent of Teach for America. So it was an American idea that was at the root there. And what I've seen around this country is this incredible flowering of these small ideas. It's kind of a ferment that's going on, but we haven't made the commitment as a society in philanthropy, the Eisner Foundation being the only foundation in the United States that's taking on this issue to bring those ideas to scale.
Fantastic. I think we should open it up. I think we're about the time to open it up for questions. So throw them out, and Mark will answer.
All right, I will bring the microphone down to anyone who has a question. Just a quick reminder, around here, questions typically start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. They are generally short. There is no such thing as a two-part question. And tonight, only Michael Eisner gets to ask follow-up questions. So who would like to go first? As I'm working my way over there, I have a question I'd like to ask, and maybe this is for both of you. We've always had a fantasy here at Live Talks Los Angeles that when we post our videos or people watch our television show on Spectrum, wouldn't it be interesting if retirees in a retirement community and high school students sat together and watched some of these conversations and then had their own conversations about whatever came up? What do you think about something like that, both of you?
Well, you know, when I tried to find places where age segregation was being upended and people across generations were coming together, the two most powerful aspects were proximity. People were near each other, and the second was common interest. I mean, one of the great examples, almost echoes what you were asking, Ted, is a place in Cleveland, Judson Manor, a upscale retirement community between the Cleveland Clinic and Case Western University and the major cultural institutions of the city, where the Judson Manor offered up free housing to graduate music students in return for playing performances at Judson Manor. So seemed like a, music-loving older people living next to music-loving and playing young people. And what unfolded from that was so much more than cultural enrichment. I was there and interviewed a woman in her 90s whose neighbor, a young violist, while she was living at Judson Manor, had gotten engaged to another young violist. And when it came time for the wedding, they asked their 90-year-old neighbor to be the maid of honor. And what started out with efficiency ended up in humanity. And I think these kinds of ideas, we need to be as creative in bringing people together as we were over the last century and splitting them apart. So pragmatic ideas like the one you raised are just what we need.
Actually, that was sort of exactly what I was wondering about. At, say, Sun City or other places where there are so many older people, have you seen some besides Judson Manor where they make an outreach to say, we've got this potential, it's all agglomerated, not in the Singapore model, but how can we make a bridge and program that will get that enrichment and interaction going?
Yeah, your question makes me think about the villain in this book are these age-segregated retirement communities like Sun City. But when you go back and try to see where they came from, it's understandable. The very first of those communities, called Youngtown, because it upheld the idea of a second youth, completely age-segregated outside of Phoenix, opened in 1955, promising people a chance to be a kid again, was featured on Dave Garroway's TV show and caused this sensation. It was actually started out of the highest ideals. It was created by a guy named Big Ben Schleifer, who was a socialist from New York who had moved to Phoenix to be a real estate agent, went back to New York, visited a friend of his who was languishing in a nursing home alone, and at a time when older people were deeply rejected in American society and said, I'm going to create a utopian community based on the kibbutz idea, where older people can have a sense of community, they can be free from ageism and prejudice, and seemed like a good idea. Del Webb based Sun City on it. Fast forward 30 years, and Youngtown, which was the first AARP chapter in America, is in the news because they're ejecting a couple, grandparents, for the heinous crime of harboring their grandson, who was an abuse victim elsewhere in Arizona. It was like the Scarlet Letter. They planted a sign on the lawn saying harboring children, and they fined them $100 a day. The New York Times pointed out that dogs were allowed at Youngtown, but not children. But so, we created these almost utopian communities of segregation. How do we move in the other direction?
The problem is, I'm sure that man was not an English major or a philosophy major. I don't think he understood people. I think the myth that a bunch of old people playing mahjong together is bliss, I don't think those people will tell you that. And I think, I'm personal experience, my mother, being the gatherer or whatever she was, insisted on always driving. But when one of her friends at her age would drive with her, she would announce to her friend, I'll drive with you. I will drive you. I don't want to hear about your dead husband. I don't want to hear about your diseases. Other than that, we can talk about anything. So I think, and I even find it with myself, I would rather be in the company of people my age that are doing something, or sitting at the table listening to my children or my grandchildren, than being at the table and hearing about golf handicap. Now, maybe that's me. So and one of the reasons that I'm such an advocate for intergenerational activities is it's interesting just to hear other people and what they're doing and being part of a group. So the idea of being segregated with a bunch of people like myself is a horror story.
It's unnatural.
I know.
It's unnatural.
So, but the idea, your idea is so obvious. And, another statistic that I got from your book is that I think it's 85% of all the new jobs, and I'm just going to put my glasses on to get correct, are either analyzing information, problem solving, being creative, or making a judgment. And again, by statistics, that is the strength of people who've had a lot of experience. So all these new jobs that are being created are really out there for people that have been doing other things in those years when they were supporting their family and being very busy. So the idea of putting people together, if just in the same environment, seems to me a happier existence. Now, obviously, health does catch up, and you can't assume that everybody getting older is capable of doing this. So there really are segments. There's the education up to college segment. There's the bringing up your children segment. There's the segment that we're talking about, which is like 55 to 70, let's say, or 75 or 80, depending on what it is. And then there is, how do we take care of people when they no longer can take care of themselves? So it's not so easy, but you're really talking about that segment before you get to that point, right?
Right. Well, a couple of thoughts on that. One is that I think what we're seeing now in society is, the accumulation of all those 2 months a year. We're starting to see a new life stage between midlife and old age, which in a lot of ways is parallel to the invention of adolescence 100 years ago. We had all these young people who weren't children, they weren't adults, we didn't know what to do with them, and we eventually created adolescence. It may have been a tragic error. I have 2 adolescents at home now. but I think we have a new stage without a name that's in that middle period, maybe mid-50s to 80, something like that. That is what's been called the season in search of a purpose. But I think so much of that purpose can be through being generative, through finding meaning, through connecting to young people. And the parallel, or the opposite of the Sun City Youngtown experience, I saw in the research for this book of communities deliberately building in opportunities for this kind of connection. So I went to a place called Gorham House in Maine, where a visionary developer had built 3 communities for older people and put preschools right in the front entrance of the building. And when you drive up to Gorham House, you see these bright colors, and there's a playground and the squeals of laughter from children. And it turns out that the apartments that are facing onto the playground are the most coveted of all of them at Gorham House. And they found a new way to do an old thing.
I think I would be at the back. I like it when they're a little older.
But with that, those kinds of, I think we need to be creative in that way and develop opportunities for these kinds of connections to happen naturally.
There was a question over here, I think, or there, I see a hand.
Hi, thank you. In many immigrant families who come to the United States, and of course there are many immigrant families here in the Los Angeles areas, there's a great value in intergenerational connection, and people rely on each other, or the younger people help the older adults to learn the languages and so on. But the value of independence and moving away and so on seems to be so prevalent. How can we help these families preserve this sense of connectedness and maybe even model that for other people who aren't immigrants?
Yeah, I'll give you a great example that I saw in the research for this book. I was in Little Havana in Miami, where a senior center had been developed, and older, mostly grandmothers, were bringing their grandchildren there. But because of federal regulations, they couldn't be fed at the senior center, so they decided to create a preschool there, employ these older women and train them to be workers at the preschool, and it's become one of the most effective and popular preschools in Miami. They've expanded to Miami Beach, and they basically developed these projects inspired by the pattern of these grandparents already being engaged with kids. We're working in California, in San Jose, with First Five in family resource centers, where we started out, did a pilot, same thing, older Latino women bringing their grandchildren to family resource centers. We have been engaging them as workers at the centers. They get a stipend, they get training, and now it's being expanded to all 27 family resource centers in Santa Clara County. And I think it's an example of kind of resilience that's already in the neighborhood. And Experience Corps, which is an Eisner Prize winner, has been doing the same thing, and it's now run by the AARP Foundation, 24 cities around the country, primarily African American and Latino elders, and it builds on the pattern in a lot of African American neighborhoods of older people who used to be on the porch, keeping an eye out on neighborhood children. They've kind of moved the porch into the school, and they're working in teams of 10 to 15, essentially saturating these schools with older people, and it's had a huge impact on the reading scores of kids. And there's now new research from Johns Hopkins Medical School showing that participation in Experience Corps reverses the preconditions of dementia. So it's having great health benefits for older people as well. So I think those are two examples of building on neighborhood traditions, on traditions in ethnic groups, and expanding them in communities today.
It must also be economic. I mean, my wife was here somewhere, was in a Swedish family whose mother and grandmother came from Sweden, and they all lived in the same house, and it was fantastic. In my case, my son graduated from college. He said he was going to live with us for a year. I thought that was fantastic. Came home the first day, and he was on the phone with a real estate agent. And I think that's also natural. There's a certain, there's a desire for young to get out on their own. think there was one question over here.
Hey, Mark, this is Sarah, McKinney Gibson, and I just wanted to say I loved your book, and one of my favorite stories that brought tears to my eyes was, I think, about an older couple named Aggie, and is it Louise? Louise. I was wondering if you could tell a little bit about that story for people who maybe aren't familiar with it.
When I've been going on the book tour for this book, I've been mostly talking about these broader societal arguments. We're having a more old than young society. People are really concerned about, a generational war of kids versus canes, and but we can do better than that. And there are a lot of those kind of broad arguments for why we should do this. But for me, the real reason I wrote this book is the two women that you mentioned, Aggie and Louise. After that Big Brother, Big Sister study and this question of where are the human beings to do the things that only people can do, seemed like a good idea to try to engage older people, but I was wondering whether it was happening anywhere. And so I went around the country, particularly looking at something called the Foster Grandparent Program. And that led me to Portland, Maine, where I met these two women who'd been foster grandparents, spending 20 hours a week working one-on-one with kids for 10 years. Aggie was the tall one. She was 4'11". Louise was 4'10". Aggie had worked as a waitress, Louise in a sawmill, and they both failed retirement. Aggie told me that she wanted to wear away, not rust away. And in fact, when I showed up, it was Halloween, and she was wearing a tiger costume, chasing children around the pediatrics ward of Maine Medical Center. And I spent a lot of time there, and they brought a huge amount of joy to Maine Medical Center. But there's a great William Blake quote, "Joy and woe are woven fine." And as you would imagine, on a pediatrics ward, there was the fair share of woe, and a lot of kids who went there were in this awful situation where, Maine's a big state. Maine Medical Center in Portland's the best hospital in the state. So if you're 8 years old, you've got cancer, you go to Maine Medical Center, but oftentimes your parents have to ultimately leave. They live 4 or 5 hours away. They're working as waitresses or in a sawmill. So you're 8 years old, you've got cancer, you're in an institutional setting hours away from home, and you're alone. And that is where Aggie and Louise came in. And Maggie Kuhn, the founder of the Grey Panthers, had a great expression. She said, "We don't have a single person to waste." And it was so vivid there. And yet it was really hard, too. And one time after I'd known Aggie and Louise for years, I asked them, why do they keep doing it, given, they could be playing golf, it's their golden years, and they face tragedy. And Aggie told me the story of a baby who was dying on the pediatrics ward, and the parents were away, and the mother made the one promise she extracted from the nurses is that the baby would not die in a crib. And so the head nurse, a woman named Sue Forth, asked Aggie if she would hold the baby when the baby was at the very end, and she said that she would. And she said that that she had always prided herself that she was strong, and she said she just felt calm. And she told me another story about a teenager, a girl named Susan, who was dying of a heart ailment and who couldn't talk to her parents because it was so tragic for the parents. So she talked to Aggie, and when Susan died, the parents called her up in the middle of the night and invited her to the funeral, and then they sent her the obituary, and it said that Susan was survived by her parents and by a foster grandmother, Aggie Bennett. And I just realized this is not just about efficiency, it's about humanity, and it's about purpose. Marge Piercy, the poet, says, "The pitcher cries for water to carry and a person for work that is real." And that was a lesson that I learned on that pediatrics ward, and then I feel like has never left me.
Well, Mark, do we have another question? If not, I'm going to...
Do you have one more question?
Okay, one more.
What a fabulous talk. I really needed to come tonight. So I think I fell in love with my husband. He's from Mexico, partly because of the intergenerational connections. And I work in healthcare. I look at the pharmaceutical industry and how it's done great things, but how it also gets out of control and perpetuates awful things like the opioid crisis. And so my question for you is, there is a whole geriatric industrial complex that has built up and that generates vast sums of revenue, encouraging, I saw a commercial the other day where it was like, go kayaking in your 70s, leave your family and go. And I found it offensive. But there's a lot of money that goes into sending those messages of separate. And these retirement homes or assisted living centers also are generating lots of money for people. And so my question to you is, this change that you're promoting, how do you address those economic interests that are going to push it in the opposite direction?
There's so much in that question. Maybe I'll just say one thing that was prompted as you were characterizing the situation. What's gotten lost in all of this separating of people is this fundamental human connection, and now we're starting to realize the costs of that. So Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General under President Obama, wrote an article in Harvard Business Review 2 years ago in which he argued that loneliness was the single greatest public health crisis in America today. And before that, epidemiologists were saying obesity was, but it turns out that being socially disconnected is one of the, obesity in many ways is a symptom of loneliness. Murthy argues that being socially isolated is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And when research's been done about which groups are the most lonely, there was an Ipsos Cigna study that came out this past year using the UCLA loneliness scale, and it showed that the two loneliest groups in society are young people and older people. And so is it any surprise, after 100 years of separating people by age, that the two most socially disconnected groups, and it's at our peril, and it also contributes to this idea of a generational war as well. I don't know if any of you saw Saturday Night Live this past weekend, in which they had a game show sent up called Millennial Millions, in which two millennials get to, a raft of prizes if they can get through a boomer crowing about, all their accomplishments as a generation for 30 seconds. Rachel Brosnahan from the Miss Maisel plays one of them. And, there is all this sense of, that we're divided by generations. But I think we can fix this, and it can fix us in the process. It can connect us to something that's, I think, a fundamental part of the human experience. And that one of my favorite quotes is a Greek proverb. It says, "Society grows great when older people plant trees under whose shade they shall never sit." And I think that's something we need to recapture.
Well, Marc, this has been fantastic. He is doing unbelievable work. 5 books, more to come, and touching on a subject that we all have to think a lot about. Marc, thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael.